Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the Center for Urban Horticulture and to the 6th program in the Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Seeking Sustainability. Today's program is an outgrowth of considerable discussion at our college over the past several years as we have sought to define and articulate our strategic themes. The college is committed to provide world-class, internationally recognized knowledge and leadership for environmental and natural resource issues. Today, we look forward to an exciting and informative program that addresses many of these issues, and we have a panel of outstanding speakers who will address all aspects of this subject. To start the second part of our program then, our first speaker is Susan Charnley. Susan grew up in this area around New York and New York City. She received a Bachelor of Arts in Biology and another Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies from the University of California at Santa Cruz. She received her PhD in Anthropology from Stanford University. She has worked for the National Forest Service for about 3 years, primarily as National Program Leader for Human Dimensions. Currently, she is in a new position as Research Social Scientist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Portland, Oregon. Over the years, her research has focused on natural resource use and management in rural communities in East Africa, Central America, and later in the United States. Her work now is with the social and economic features of sustainability as they relate to the new U.S. Forest Service planning rule. Susan's talk this morning is titled Sustainability on Federal Forest Lands. Please help me to welcome Dr. Charnley.
Today I'm going to talk about sustainability as it relates to federal forest management, and specifically as it relates to the management of federal forests that are administered by the National Forest Service. The Forest Service mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. So you can see right away that the concept of sustainability is embedded in the Forest Service mission. The Forest Service has adopted a definition of sustainability that entails meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability to meet the needs of future generations. Today I want to talk about 3 things. I'm going to start by giving you a brief history of how the Forest Service has conceptualized and implemented sustainability in federal forest management over the years. Then I want to give you some specific examples of what the Forest Service is doing now to implement the notion of sustainable forest management. And then I want to touch on some of the challenges and opportunities that exist in managing the national forests and grasslands sustainably. Because I'm an anthropologist, I'm going to emphasize sustainability as a human value, as a social value, really not as some sort of objective, independent state of social, economic, and ecological systems that we can describe and perhaps achieve, but rather, again, as a social value and process. Well, the Forest Service was established in 1905, and it initially managed federal forests under the mandate of the Organic Act of 1897. This stated that federal forests should be managed to promote forest protection, watershed protection, and timber production. From 1905 to the early 1940s, the Forest Service approach to management was largely custodial. The Forest Service acted as sort of a guardian or caretaker of the federal forests. Timber production was really minimal because most timber was being produced from private forest lands, and private landowners didn't want competition from federal timber that might depress the price of lumber. Grazing of cattle and sheep was actually the main commodity use of Forest Service lands up until World War II. Well, that shifted with World War II, at which time the demand for lumber in the United States escalated dramatically. First, the demand for wood grew to support the war effort. Wood was used to build packing crates in which military supplies were shipped. But following the war, veterans came home and they started families, and interest rates were low, and they wanted houses. So there was a dramatic increase in demand for lumber for housing construction. People started to look at federal forests as a source of timber because private lands had been largely cut over by that time. Well, between 1945 and 1960 then, there was a dramatic increase in the production of timber from federal forests. In 1941, approximately 1.5 billion board feet of timber were produced from Forest Service lands. By 1969, this figure had risen to about 12 billion board feet, or roughly 20% of the national supply of timber. This increase in demand was felt most notably in the Pacific Northwest, which supplied softwood timber. And since during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, timber production from federal forests remained at the levels of somewhere between 10 and 12 billion board feet annually. Well, timber production during this time was managed according to the concept of sustained yield, which Dr. Baer, I think, explained well. Basically, sustained yield forestry focused on single species management. You attempted to maximize the harvest that you could get without causing a decline in the species. Ecological sustainability was seen as more of a constraining factor on the ability of people to manage to maximize resource outputs. So that was sort of the early conceptualization then of ecological sustainability as implemented by the Forest Service, was sustained yield forestry. Well, accompanying that was a notion of social and economic sustainability per se, which was embodied in the notion of community stability. There has long been a view that rural communities surrounding the national forest should benefit from products produced on Forest Service lands. And there was this notion that if we were able to provide an even flow of timber from the federal forests, this would provide a stable source of jobs and income for people in rural communities, and that we could maintain communities in sort of a stable state. So community stability was tied up with the notion of producing a non-declining yield of timber from federal forests. In cases where the Forest Service was not able to maintain this even flow, there were efforts to provide economic assistance to communities so that stability would not be disrupted. Well, at the same time that demand for timber production was increasing during the 40s and 50s, other uses of the national forests were also expanding, and recreation uses in particular. And people who went to enjoy the forest for recreation began to look at these large clear cuts that were out there, and they started to get upset about it, and they started to wonder what the ecological consequences of some of these timber harvest practices were. And there began to be a lot of social controversy around how federal forests were managed, and a lot of demand to try to get other uses and values from forests besides just timber production. Well, this resulted in the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, which basically mandated that all the uses and benefits of the national forests and grasslands should be treated equally. And specifically, those uses and benefits were defined as recreation, range, timber, fish, wildlife, and watershed protection. Again, it wasn't prescriptive. It didn't say, here's the balance that you should manage for. It simply said, manage for all these uses in a way that responds to public desires and demands for these different values. And it recognized that those uses could change over time with changing social values. Well, the concept of sustained yield was also reaffirmed in this act. It was also said that we should try and produce the maximum outputs of resources that we can in a regular, periodic fashion over time. Well, the 1960s and 1970s saw a dramatic rise in the environmental consciousness of the American public. By 1990, environmentalism had sort of reached its heights. Public awareness of environmental problems was increasing dramatically, and there was a much increasing demand for the non-commodity values that federal forests could provide. By non-commodity values, I mean recreation values, ecological values, cultural values, spiritual and aesthetic values. People were demanding that the Forest Service shift away from this emphasis on commodity production. And all of this resulted in a paradigm shift in federal forest management that took place in the early 90s, which went to more of an ecosystem management approach. Ecosystem management differed from sustained yield because rather than looking at the management of individual species, it tried to take into account the management of ecosystems as a whole, and it viewed people as a part of those ecosystems. The goal was to ensure the long-term health and sustainability of the ecosystem and of ecosystem processes. Well, ecosystem management is now the direction that the Forest Service is pursuing with regard to federal forest management. But accompanying this shift, there's also been a shift in the notion of community stability that preceded it. We recognize now that, of course, with this changing shift in values for managing federal forests, there's been a dramatic drop-off in the rate of timber production from federal forest lands. Throughout the 90s and into the foreseeable future, federal forests are predicted to supply somewhere between 3 and 4 billion board feet of timber per year. That represents, at this point, maybe about 4% of the national supply of timber. Well, of course, we realize as an agency that we can't produce a stable, continuous supply of timber, that timber harvests are going to decline, but we also recognize that federal forest management policy is not the only thing that affects conditions in rural communities and economies. For example, the business practices of the wood products industry have a dramatic impact on job opportunities in these, quote, forest-dependent communities. And that really, what we need to think about is how can we support community resiliency, or in other words, the ability of communities to adapt successfully to the changes that take place in society all the time and that are inevitable. Well, where are we today? Again, the Forest Service is trying to approach sustainable forest management and manage for more than outputs like timber supply, but for a variety of social and economic values, and also with an effort to maintain ecosystem processes. Let me talk about a couple of the specific things that the Forest Service is doing to try and implement sustainability. On the social and economic side, the Forest Service is not just about what takes place on Forest Service lands, but it also tries to provide assistance to communities. And the state and private forestry branch of the Forest Service has a cooperative forestry program that specifically provides technical and financial assistance to help rural and urban citizens care for forests and also sustain their communities. So there are a number of economic assistance programs, for example, that try to help communities diversify their economies and take advantage of the new economic opportunities that are provided by forests around recreation and tourism, for example, or restoration efforts, that sort of thing. Well, the Forest Service is also engaging in a number of sustainability monitoring efforts. The sustainability monitoring is a way of trying to identify criteria and indicators that can be measured to address and assess our progress towards sustainable forest management. The Forest Service has been engaged in 2 types of sustainability monitoring, and the purpose of this monitoring is to provide input into the adaptive management process so that we can use information we get from this to make management policy decisions. The first sustainability monitoring effort is taking place at the national level. It's the Montreal Process Criterion Indicators effort. The United States became a signatory along with 9 other countries to the Montreal Process in 1995. And basically what this is it's a set of criterion indicators for sustainable forest management that are then evaluated so that we can track our progress towards sustainable forestry in the United States. And it provides a common set of indicators that can be used by different countries that have a large proportion of temperate or boreal forests to try and compare results. So we've been doing that. We've also been participating in the Roundtable on Sustainable Forestry, which is a multi-stakeholder group that discusses the criterion indicators. And we're taking the lead in writing a report that will serve as a baseline for where we are now with regard to sustainable forestry in the United States. The second effort has been called the Local Unit Criterion Indicators Development Project, or the Lucid Project, and we've been involved in this over the last couple of years. Sustainability, as we have heard, is a question of, in part, at what scale are we trying to sustain things? So we have the national level, we also have the local level, and here we're trying to focus on what's happening at the forest management unit level. And so the Forest Service had 6 national forests where we went out and worked with communities to try and identify a set of social, economic, and ecological indicators at the local level that would represent sustainable forest management. And then they went out and tried to see how well can we measure those indicators and how can we use this information to help us make decisions about forest management. This was really a pilot project, but it's something that the Forest Service is thinking about implementing more broadly. Well, a third thing that's a major feature here, really what determines how forests get managed on the ground is the land management planning process that takes place for individual forests. And the Forest Service has a planning rule that guides how that process takes place locally. That planning rule is currently under revision. The original planning rule was in 1982. It was revised in the year 2000, and then that revision was challenged and has been criticized. And actually within the next month, the Forest Service will be publishing a draft planning rule in the Federal Register that talks about how it's going to try to implement sustainable forest management now. Again, though, social and economic and ecological sustainability are adopted as the goals for forest management. And then the question is, how do we go about that through the forest planning process? Well, how exactly we will try and implement this new approach remains to be seen, because as I said, the rule is still in draft form. It's about to come out for public comment. People are writing directives to try and specify how we can implement this new approach, but even those are still under debate. And so it's still a process that we're trying to work our way through. Well, as the Forest Service strives to practice sustainable forest management, there are a number of challenges that are involved. But I think there are also a number of opportunities that exist. I've tried to talk about how forest management over the last century has really shifted in response to the changing social values of the American public. Whereas forests were valued primarily as sources of commodity resources early in the 1900s, over the last 50 years or so, there's been a shift towards the non-commodity values of federal forests. Well, what are some of the challenges then? You know, I think our previous two speakers and I myself would emphasize the fact that there's a whole mix of social values that people want to see federal forests managed for. And so while, you know, one person is sitting down having their cup of coffee waiting to be told how to manage in an ecological fashion, somebody else is out there sort of negotiating and trying to figure out what is that balance of uses and values that we're going to manage for. And I think that as we do that, we're faced with a number of very difficult decisions, because people want different things. You can't meet everybody's needs simultaneously. What is it that you decide that you are going to sustain, and who benefits from that, and to who is there a cost from the trade-offs that are associated with making those decisions about what values we can sustain? Of course, at the Forest Service, when we don't quite get the right mix, you know, we're always subject to litigation and appeals, and we end up not being able to do much of anything. So this question of how can we do a better job at this is really a challenge for us. But I think that there are also opportunities here, and I think the opportunities lie in the fact that the Forest Service recognizes the way to progress is to engage much more carefully in what they're calling collaborative stewardship. And I think we recognize that we don't operate in a vacuum, and we can't ensure the ecological sustainability of National Forest Service lands by ourselves, that we have to work with people in order to do that. I think there's an opportunity here for much more deep and meaningful engagement with the public about what values people want to see sustained. We can do a better job of understanding people's relationships with forests and how we contribute to social and economic well-being. And I think as we make choices that contribute better to supporting those values and those relationships people have with forests, we do a much better job of building the capacity of communities and of building the willingness of people to engage with us jointly in collaborative forest stewardship. And so that's where I see the opportunity lying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charnley, for that nice overview and summary of sustainability on our national forest system. Our next speaker, Bill Palak, comes to us from the National Park Service. Bill grew up in Tucson, Arizona, where he graduated with honors from the University of Arizona in 1970. He began working for the National Park Service back in 1967 as a seasonal trail laborer, and his career has covered states from New York to Alaska and Arizona to Washington State. In his 30-plus years with the National Park Service, Bill has held positions such as ranger, rescuer, law enforcer, and judicial liaison. In 1992, he was selected as superintendent of the North Cascades National Park System complex, which includes the North Cascades National Park, as well as the Ross Lake and Lake Chelan National Recreation areas. In 1994, Bill was one of 13 National Park Service managers who drafted the plan for reorganizing the National Park Service. Recent honors include a Secretarial Award, Superior Performance Awards, and Service Awards from the Pima County Planning and Zoning Commission, from the Mayor of Tucson, Arizona, and the Pacific West region. In 1999, he was awarded the Department of the Interior Meritorious Service Award by Secretary Bruce Babbitt. Bill's talk this morning is titled Land Stewardship, Sustainability, and the National Parks. Please join me in welcoming Bill Palak.
Thank you, Dr. Bear. I appreciate the invitation by the College for the National Park Service to participate in this conversation. The National Park Service is comprised of 386 separate units that span the United States, literally from the Virgin Islands to Saipan. And they include large natural areas such as the charismatic volcano Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Recreation areas such as Cooley Dam National Recreation Area in eastern Washington. Battlefields and military parks such as San Juan Island. Geologic and archaeological monuments like Craters of the Moon and Hagerman fossil beds. Historical parks such as Fort Vancouver, Fort Clatsop, and Whitman Mission. And national memorials that range from the Washington Monument here to Independence Hall. The mission of the National Park Service is to care for the special places saved by the American people so that all may experience our heritage. In that context, the National Park Service serves as touchstones of our distinctly eclectic American culture and heritage. From the absolute wildness that our forefathers encountered, to the battlefields and special sites that preserved and expanded our freedoms, from distinctive contributions to the world such as jazz, to reminders of our shame such as Andersonville and Manzanar. In that context then, the National Park Service plays a role in sustaining American culture through preserving examples of the raw material from which that culture has grown and continues to evolve. The second component where the National Park Service is involved in sustainability is what I'll refer to as the mechanical or lifestyle elements of sustainability within the National Park System. This has to do with the resources we consume in pursuing a certain standard of living, whether in our personal lives or in our businesses. Now, E.O. Wilson refers to this as the ecological footprint argument, and estimates that if we were to have the entire world living at the current American standard of living, consuming our resources at the rate Americans currently do, it would require 4 planet Earths. With few exceptions, the consumable natural resources of the park units in the lower 48 are not available for exploitation or use. So we could argue that one could argue that we pursue the most sustainable form of land stewardship. However, as Dr. Kimmons reminds us, one shoe doesn't fit all sizes. And we need to be careful about embracing one specific style of land stewardship. We're constantly working to try to develop sustainable tourism and recreational opportunities in the national parks, while at the same time recovering land where those forms of recreation have proven to be non-sustainable. A great example in the park I manage would be Cascade Pass, where we've been working for the past 30 years to restore the impacts of overuse by the public. Parks have the opportunity and perhaps even the obligation to become classrooms of sustainable lifestyles. Whether that's through land use and design, through architecture. This is an example of the brand new visitor center at Zion National Park, which features alternative energy use, had high LEED green points for use of recycled materials, and won several architecture awards. In engineering, through transportation, many parks have become standards now for mass transportation, how to move people around, get them out of their cars. Green procurement. If you look closely at this list, you'll see that the National Park Service toilet paper now is 100% recycled. Recycling, whether that's through providing the instruments themselves for recycling or educating people on the need for recycling. And minimizing solid waste through water conservation, alternative energy, and energy conservation. This is the ranger station at Hozameen on the Canadian border, and it's fully photovoltaic for its energy source. There's another building there that's operated by Seattle City Light, and while this is off the grid, I take a great deal of pleasure in selling electricity to Seattle City Light. This is a portable solar generator that we purchased last year to use for off-site audiovisual programs and also to power the ranger station at Hozameen. And in technology, the lower right is a wind-powered wind warning gauge at Lake Meredith National Recreation Area in Texas. Parks have been likened to cathedrals in terms of the reverence with which the American public holds them. Imagine if they were also likened to living laboratories on sustainable lifestyles. It's my firm belief that we should keep moving forward in the National Park Service so that when a visitor enters a National Park Service unit, they're palpably struck by the change in lifestyles and behavior that's expected there. As a model, we should be generating everything from sustainable practices that people see right away, like the transportation system at Yosemite, to things they can become educated on, like sustainable diets in our concession facilities. I'd like to move now to land stewardship and sustainable ecosystems. During the 35 years I've been working with the National Park Service, I've been able to watch, experience, and participate in the dramatic shift from an inwardly focused, recreation-based organization with a taxidermist understanding of ecosystem management to an organization that truly appreciates and develops genuine partnerships, that's transforming its default decision trigger from recreational opportunities to resource conditions, and that is expanding its field of view to embrace a landscape level perspective. I firmly believe that no single land management agency or regulatory body or landowner can independently ensure a healthy and sustainable ecosystem any larger than a tabletop terrarium. That's because of the challenges that face us all. And those challenges include accelerating loss of open space, intensified landscape fragmentation, further degradation of wildlife habitat, alarming declines in the viability of a wide range of biological species, potentially significant stresses to the Earth systems that provide essential ecosystem services, and the immediate challenge that we face is a lack of a census of plants, animals, and microorganisms that comprise an ecosystem. It's like trying to rebuild the engine of your car when you only have a workbook that has 10% of the parts in it. Now, E.O. Wilson and others are convinced that amassing all the information needed for a complete owner's manual can be accomplished within the next 25 years. They also believe that this is an essential step towards realizing truly healthy and sustainable ecosystems. So what's the role of the National Park Service in all this, in this challenge? I think we can supply reference stations for living laboratories. The land of the National Park Service is not very often totally pristine, if ever, but they're usually the least disturbed sites in the region. We can be an active participant and a genuine partner, which is a whole lot different than the way we used to approach partnerships, which were come partner with us, do things on our terms, and do things for us. I think we're learning how to be genuine partners in dealing with private landowners, with state and federal agencies, with other government and regulatory bodies, and most importantly, with the public. We can become a better public educator and communicator. For years, we've had interpretive programs that talk about wildlife species or things like that. We're not really helping hold our role in the education community. That's not teaching people to be advocates. It's providing them the information they need to make their lifestyle decisions. And we've got a program called the Natural Resource Challenge. The gross objective of which is to raise, through Congress, increase our appropriation by $100 million over a 5-year period. And the program's dedicated to things like inventorying and monitoring resource conditions within National Park Service units and surrounding landscapes, with a concept called learning networks to increase both the availability and opportunities for scientific inquiry within national parks, and translating that information with people and through programs to make it consumable by the average American. The Cooperative Ecosystem Studies units are a key role, and the University of Washington hosts one of those that involves multiple federal agencies and multiple universities. In short, we're trying to reconfigure the parks so that the parks are for science and science is used for park management. We also are recognizing our role to serve as a convener. 2 examples. About 1.5 years ago, the Earthwatch Institute came to North Cascades to see if North Cascades would host their conservation research station, the special program. It would be the only one in North America. Rather than taking that honor and accepting it exclusively for North Cascades, we reached out and encouraged them to partner instead with the Skagit Watershed Council, of which we're a member, but there are also 32 other agencies, units of government, and advocacy groups, all concerned with restoring and protecting salmon habitat in the Skagit River. They accepted that challenge, and I believe because of that are going to be much more effective in the research program they put together and the use of the Earthwatch Institute program in North America. Another example is the cooperative task agreement that we've developed with the College of Forest Resources Society for a dialogue about the Natural Resource Challenge to happen sometime next year. This will hopefully be a 3-day dialogue regarding the natural resource challenge and its ability to mesh with and promote sustainable ecosystem health in the Pacific Northwest. Lord Bryce suggested that the national park idea was the best idea America ever had. And certainly it's a concept that's been adopted by countries throughout the world. It was one of the greatest conservation innovations in the 20th century. At this point in time, we can only dimly perceive what the conservation innovations of the 21st century will be. But two things are certain. By necessity, they will be both collaborative and cross-sectional in design and their implementation, and the National Park Service recognizes that it should and will play an active but not controlling role in these endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that very interesting talk on how the National Park Service is approaching the topic of sustainability. We now turn to the state lands, in particular the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Forest Trust lands here in the state of Washington. And our speaker will be Angus Brody. Angus is currently Assistant Division Manager in the Land Management Division. He received his Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in England in 1989 and a Master of Forestry from Oxford University in 1993. After graduating from Newcastle, he went to Bolivia for 3 years and worked as an agricultural extensionist for the United Nations Association of International Science. After graduating from Oxford a few years later, he spent 5 years as an independent research associate on assignments with the Overseas Development Institute, Oxford University, 2 centers for research in agroforestry and agronomy, and the USDA Forest Service. His areas of research included forest genetics, silviculture, agroforestry, and socioeconomics of trees and forest management in rural communities. He joined the Washington State Department of Natural Resources Forest Inventory Section in 1998, and he presently manages programs for sustainable harvest, forest resource inventory, planning and tracking, and landscape planning and forest growth modeling. His topic today is sustainable yield calculation on Washington State's forest trust lands. Please join me in welcoming Angus Brody.
Good morning. I think all land managers today are working on defining what sustainable forestry means to them, and the Department of Natural Resources is no exception. Today, I'm going to present some of the processes that the department is using to help define sustainable forestry for trust forest lands in Washington State. There are 3 basic components to achieving sustainable forestry. The first of these is planning, and this is going to be the major subject of my presentation today. And planning involves essentially the setting of goals, the choosing of strategies to reach those goals or objectives, and designing criteria and indicators by which to measure them, and detailing some of the processes of adaptive management to allow for change. And lastly, but not leastly, also the role of public involvement in the planning process. The other components of achieving sustainable forestry are equally important, but their implementation, the basic silviculture and engineering of your plans. And last is the monitoring. Are we achieving the goals that we set out, that we implemented through the landscape? For the department, these are set within a legal and a political framework, and I'm going to touch on some of these points in the presentation. And lastly, for the department, all these 3 components, planning, implementation, and monitoring, are with a philosophy of adaptive management, i.e. the acceptance that change will be part of the process. Currently, the department is undertaking a process of recalculating the sustainable harvest. And it's taking this opportunity to examine some key policy and management strategy choices that will help to define what is sustainable forestry for Washington public trust lands. The key elements of this process of developing or recalculating the sustainable harvest are soliciting public input. They're developing a set of alternatives to meet a given set of goals. And they include some sophisticated modeling to attempt to forecast the outcomes of these different alternatives to help decision makers make decisions. And lastly, there's a portion of setting or designing a set of criteria and indicators, not just on timber production, but on the full array of criterion indicators to reflect sustainable forestry, so economic, social, and environmental. The planning goals that the department has set for these alternatives basically are three. The first, and maybe the most obvious, is to meet federal and state statutes. The second is to meet our trust mandate as a department, and I'll touch on this in a little bit later. But essentially, the trust mandate can be defined as the requirement to produce near and short-term revenue for the various trusts. The third goal that we set for defining and for developing alternatives was to meet our Habitat Conservation Plan goals. The Habitat Conservation Plan, for those of you who don't know, is a multiple species habitat conservation plan for about 1.6 million acres of the land that we manage. But the major part of the conservation plan is that it provides certainty and predictability, not only of conservation benefits or of ecosystem management or biological conservation, but it's also meant to provide this certainty and predictability of financial support for the beneficiaries. For those of you who don't know, I'll just outline a very brief context for the department. It manages approximately 2.1 million acres of forest land in Washington state, of which about 1.4 million is here west of the Cascade Crest, and of which the current sustainable harvest is what we're working on. These lands are held in perpetuity for a diverse group of public trusts, including the Common School Construction Fund. The department has a legal duty to produce long-term revenue for these trust beneficiaries. Some of them receive the monies into a permanent fund, others receive the money as cash flow into their budgetary accounts. And this legal duty to produce long-term revenue is commonly called the trust mandate. The legal framework is provided in numerous RCWs for the department, but the two that sit very importantly on the process of recalculating the sustainable harvest and for defining anything along the lines of sustainable forestry are these two. The first is that the department will manage the state-owned forest lands on a sustained yield basis, insofar compatible with other statutory directives. Although this was developed in the 70s with the concept of sustained yield, the traditional concept, I think it can be interpreted today in the light of sustainable forestry and looking at the broader set of requirements from an ecological, economic, and social, and seeking social benefits. However, the second RCW that is of relevance here is the one below that reads, the department is directed to offer for sale the sustainable harvest. This RCW provides a route of accountability for the department. In other words, the sustainable harvest level that we calculate and that the Board of Natural Resources adopts for the department is not just a forecasting number of the amount of harvest we will produce, but it is also our deliverable. As I mentioned before, the department in 1997 signed a multiple species habitat conservation plan, a contractual agreement with the federal services and the federal government to carry out a conservation plan on 1.6 million acres of the lands that the department manages. The goals of these plans are quite diverse, although there are some quite implicit strategies embedded in the plan. But the first is to provide certainty and stability in complying with the Endangered Species Act. The second is to ensure future productivity of trust lands through ecosystem management techniques. The third is to maintain options for future sources of income. And this is built upon a philosophy of respecting biological conservation and the potential future options that biological conservation may have for future sources of income. The fourth is that the plan is to maintain or increase management flexibility through an adaptive management approach. With these three stated goals, which are just listed here as a reminder below, the department went out and solicited public input and essentially asked the public what they would like to see and how they would like to see the department manage the public trust lands. So at the beginning of this year, the department started this process and held 6 public meetings, had a number of focus group meetings, and held numerous individual stakeholder meetings with important stakeholders around the state, sister agencies, and private organizations. And also carried out a telephone poll of around 500 citizens, and also had a written survey of 200 citizens. And from all this information, we gathered one really central message that the public was asking the department to do. And that was to seek a balance between the economic and the environmental benefits and costs of managing public forests. We related the information back to the Board of Natural Resources and the department, and essentially we summarized over the 2,000 comments that we received from the public meetings and the written comments that we received in letters into the following 4 questions. The first related to how the department should manage for conservation benefits. You'll notice here that the question really isn't whether the department should manage for conservation, but how it should. And I think this is an important point. The department, I think, is in a position now to say not whether it is going to manage for conservation benefits, but really how it should. The debate about whether it should or shouldn't has occurred. Now we move on to how best to do it. Essentially, we captured this from the public comments that we received as being a dichotomy of 2 approaches. Should this be a zoned approach? Should we parcel up the land and say, these will be set aside, these will be lands that we manage? Or should we take a more integrated approach? Obviously, the debate is not on either of these spectrums, and that probably is there somewhere in between. But this is a good way to capture the debate. The second question that we got from the comments was, how intensively should the DNR manage? And intensity can be interpreted in many ways. The length of the rotation, as we've captured it here, but it also means how much forest investment, what type of thinnings, what type of silviculture do we impose. The intensity of management not only affects the ecological processes, as one of our earlier speakers hinted at, but it also can affect the visual nature, the aesthetics, or the beauty of the forest. The third question is a little bit more technical and a little bit more specialized to the department, but essentially how we should organize our harvest. We manage around 14 trusts in total, and each of these trusts have different demands. From our public review, essentially there was a diverse set of views of whether we should manage each individual trust according to its demands, or whether we should manage the lands as an aggregate. And if we manage it as an aggregate, should we manage it on a small aggregate trust groups or large? Now, maybe to the novice, they would think that this would have little difference except for the financial side of the equation, but it doesn't. If you aggregate costs, if you aggregate lands and land ownerships together and manage them as one, you can have significant environmental impacts. If you manage them at a small level, you can have significant economic costs. So this becomes an important question. I think Bruce Baer mentioned in his first presentation the questions of trade-offs, and this is really where those trade-offs may be played out. The third question, or the fourth question that we got from the comments was, how much older forest should there be? And we separated this out to as a social issue, rather than an issue that was mixed up in how we should manage for biological conservation or ecosystems. Because from the comments that we were receiving, there were many that were directed at the size and at the age of the forest that they wished to see out on the landscapes. And of course, there is no right answer. So is it a little or a lot that we should have, and what is desirable? From these questions and from extensive debate among a technical review committee that works with the department, we went about designing a set of alternatives. And the design of our alternatives was obviously to capture these four major themes that were raised by the public. But it was also to bring some of the new science forward. Since 1992, when the department developed its Forest Resource Plan, and 1996 and 97, when it developed the Habitat Conservation Plan, much new material in ecosystem management has come into the literature. And we wanted to include this into the planning process. The last point that we wanted to address some of the concerns that some stakeholders have identified with some of the old policies in the 1992 Forest Resource Plan. And the aim of these alternatives was to develop suites of policies and strategies that would better represent sustainable forestry, or at least our understanding of it for the future. Without running through all the detail of all these 7 alternatives that we've developed, I just wanted to mention the essential components of them. First, they increase as you go down in their level of complexity, not only in the silviculture that they apply at the stand level, but in their landscape management. 1 through 6 of these alternatives all follow our current habitat conservation plan strategies. They're all essentially much along a zone type of management approach, while 7 tries to take a more integrated and unzoned approach. The way I would characterize them, though, is that 1 through 7, none of them are meant to be the silver bullet or the panacea of sustainable forestry. Each of them contain elements. And we designed them for the Board of Natural Resources and the department to get an understanding of what sustainable forestry may look like. Just to give you a very quick overview of the modeling process, as I've mentioned already, we have a set of policies and goals. We build a set of alternatives, and from that inevitably come a set of assumptions and data inputs, which enter into a modeling process. From this modeling process, we hope to get a set of outputs. And from that, we need to devise a set of criteria and indicators that reflect environmental, economic, and social costs and benefits of each of these 7 alternatives. And with that information, the department will make a decision on what may constitute sustainable forestry for Washington public lands. Briefly, the metrics of sustainable forestry from the model need to be clearly understood. Some of them are direct. Some of the outputs that we get from the model directly relate to things that we can measure and have a very clear understanding on the ground. These are such as habitat conditions, the areas that we're going to harvest, how much volume we're going to be able to produce, and what sort of costs and expenses are included in the developing of those that volume or those habitat conditions. There's a set of indirect or secondary outputs that we're also attempting to derive from this modeling process. These are the ones that possibly interest folks more, but they're indirect. And I think there are some challenges with producing those, such as what is the correlation between habitat conditions and wildlife populations? What are the effects on water resources from the areas that we harvest and the intensity that we manage? What are the all-important cumulative impacts of all our actions over time? However, through both of these processes and both of these sets of metrics, these will be provided to the decision makers to help define what sustainable forestry is for the department. For those of you who are interested in receiving or hearing results today, unfortunately I'm not going to be able to give you that because we're only at the beginning of this process. Currently we're developing the models of these 7 alternatives, which will then enter into an EIS, which will then be published sometime in mid-summer of 2003. From that process, we have a comment period, which is very similar to the scoping period that we had at the beginning of this year, where we go out and solicit public input. All that information needs to go back to the Board of Natural Resources to help them make a selection on what a preferred alternative will look like, of which we will finally make a decision around the end of next year, of 2003. So, some concluding remarks. As I said, the 3 principal components for achieving sustainable forestry are planning, and the one I touched on most today. The other 2, implementation and monitoring, are equally important. And for the department, they come within a legal and a political framework. But they also are very importantly all fit under a philosophy of adaptive management, or the acceptance of change within the process. And for the department, what we're really seeking is trying to find a point within, in the intersection of these 3 circles, of the environmental, economic, and social values that we have today. And we need to recognize that this point is going to change over time, and the department is going to need to change over time also. Thank you.